Hey, Dave here with Crooked Pigs. We're going to show you today how to trim a rack of spare ribs. These are obviously some Prairie Fresh ribs that we have here and have some good marbling in them. But before I get going here, I just want to kind of show you what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a rack of ribs when I go to the store. So obviously looking for brand out here out of the gate. And like I said, we have some Prairie Fresh here. Sometimes we'll use some Smithfield ones that are pre-injected and stuff like that we really enjoy as well. But again, today we have a Prairie Fresh one here. What I'm looking for here is I'm looking for a few different things, and you'll hear some people call this a unicorn of the perfect rib is kind of like a unicorn of a rib, because there's some specific things that you're looking for. So one of the first things I'm looking for is this marbling that you're going to see, and you're going to see a lot of this really fine marbling up in here, and then back here. I might trim just a little bit of this off, and you'll see more marbling back in here. So I'm looking for a rib that has a lot of that white fat in there. Not too much, but obviously you definitely want to have some. Then the next thing I'm looking for, and this is more, it's kind of hard to show on a video, but it's kind of a thickness. I kind of do like the lobster grab almost, and I kind of grab this front part of the rack, and I can feel how thick that meat is, and you can almost see that there. You can see where the bone is, and then you can kind of see some meat in between there, and then it kind of comes up over that bone. If it's too thin, you're not going to have a good bite for the judge. Now, you're going to want it to be a thick, meaty rib, which this one is. Sometimes you're going to find a rack of ribs that has kind of almost a second layer of meat separated with some fat in between there, and you're not going to want to get that type of a rack. And I don't have one to show you today, but this is a good example of one that you do want to get. Some guys might go off of the weight too, you know, how many pounds you have here or how much the rack is. But for me, it's more off of feel when I just grab the side of it here and kind of tell through the heart of the rib here. Then the next thing, which for me, it's kind of the most disappointing part of the rack of the rib, is the straightness of the bones, because you've already passed a couple of the tests, the thickness, the marbling, and then 9 times out of 10 I flip them over on the back side and these bones aren't straight. And you can see these are fairly straight, so I kind of start looking at the ribs where I'm going to be turning them in. So you'll look back here, I'm not turning these ribs in, but you can see these bones are pretty straight. Once you start moving up into these ones up here, you can see the straightness in them, right? And they're starting to curve just a little bit, but that's okay. You might be asking yourself, why do I want a straight rib? When you're slicing these and you're giving them to the judge, you got to think about how much meat is going to be on both sides of that bone. And if you have to kind of cut it at a weird angle because the bone's curved, you might have a piece of rib that just doesn't have enough meat on it. So the judge, when they take that bite, they're barely getting any meat on it because the bone isn't straight there, and you had to cut it just right to make it look good in the box. But again, you can see these are pretty straight. If you can't quite tell sometimes, you can kind of put your finger on it and push down and almost feel that where that bone runs, and it just kind of gives you a good idea of where it's at. So a lot of it when you're looking for a rib is kind of look and feel, seeing what you have, and then it's weird when you cut into them sometimes, even it looks a little bit different than it did when it was in the cryo before you did it. So but like I said, we're out here at the Jack. We're cooking against some barbecue royalty, and so we want to start with some good meat. So that's why we got the Prairie Fresh here. So the next thing is to cut into this. And I'm going to give you a secret of the pros. And I learned this pretty quickly. When I was trimming ribs at my house, I usually don't get the St. Louis style. I'll just get the spare ribs that are a little bigger, because then I can trim it down to the size that I want it to be. And here it already comes cut. And I don't really like that, because I feel like the butcher's already done the job that I would prefer to do. Sometimes they'll trim it up a little too much or not enough, and it just doesn't work out quite as well as if I trim it myself. So that's pro tip 1. The next pro tip that I do is I put these guys in the freezer for about 30 minutes to an hour. Not to freeze them completely solid, but just partially. A couple reasons I do that. One, the meat cuts a lot better when it's partially frozen. And then secondly, I almost call it like a meat slurpee, but the juices that are all in here kind of turn into a slush. And then it's not getting all on your board, all over your floor, all over your shirt. And so, like I said, when you cut into this cryo, it's going to be kind of partially frozen, so you can just discard it and get it out of your way, and it's not a mess. So I'm going to go ahead and cut into these. The first thing that I like to do is I kind of like to come up here, and some guys will come under here and take their knife and kind of cut through it. I don't really care. I'm just going to come up here and start ahead and kind of just clip through some of that meat that I don't want. You'll see, just kind of get rid of that there. Now I'll kind of flip it over that I've got a head start on this rack. I'm going to put my knife in there and just kind of get into that cryo a little bit. I know a lot of you guys probably seen a lot of videos like this online, so trimming ribs are pretty easy. I know when I first started cooking ribs, I was a little intimidated by spare ribs. They're just bigger, a little more awkward to handle. So I do baby backs, not obviously at a pro comp, but just at home in my backyard. But then as I got more familiar with trimming these and not as intimidated, the meat's just way better. It's a better cut of meat for me. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to flip this way here real quick. And I'm trying to get this little bit of a flap here. So I'm just going to kind of peel up some of this meat. And what you're really trying to do here is you're trying to get rid of some of this stuff that's just not going to cook very well and not have an even bite for the judge. So I kind of just take my knife and just kind of start trimming some of that off a little bit. And you'll see these bones. I'm not hitting into those bones. I'm just kind of going over them, right? Just kind of being careful so I don't hit into those bones. But at the same time, trying to get as much of that extra meat off so the judges don't get kind of a burnt piece of meat on there. Sometimes some of that's trimmed pretty well, so then I might kind of skip up here to some of these bones up here and kind of do the same little deal here. Getting rid of some of that meat, just pulling at it lightly and getting rid of that meat. And you can keep trimming this up as much as you want as you go along here. Getting rid of some of this fat, some of that meat. Then what I'm going to do in my mind, and you'll see how these ribs are a little bit more curved now that we've gotten it out of the cryo. You can almost see where that bone's running. Still going to work, but it's curved a little bit. But now we got some decisions to make here. Typically, I like to leave about 8 ribs per rack that I'm cooking on the drum. And at home, I would probably only trim off maybe 1 rib on one side, the rib on the other side. The reason I do that, if you look at this rib right here, there's like no meat up above there, right? And there's hardly anything on that side too. So if you're eating that at home, you're just eating bone and maybe a little bit of gristle. So I'm obviously going to cut that off. When you get down on this side, it's pretty thin and floppy. And we flip it over here, it's just kind of a weird piece. It's going to not cook evenly because of the shape of it. So at home, I'm always going to trim that off. But at a comp, probably out of every rack, I'm probably only going to get about 4 ribs out of every rack that I'm going to turn in. So I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive with my comp trim than I would be at home. So again, I'm going to kind of visualize what ribs I want to turn in, kind of in the heart of the rack of the ribs. When I think of a rib, I almost think of like a watermelon, how the watermelon has the sweetest part in the middle of it. A rib's a similar way. There's kind of a heart of the rack of ribs. And I kind of like to think of that probably somewhere in about here. And so I'll probably have this rack be about that long, so then I have 1 rib to try on one side and maybe 1 rib to try on the other side. So, and you'll see kind of some of this stuff up here. I'm not even going to waste time trimming that off. I'm just going to cut those ribs off. And same with down here. So, like I said, some decision time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to get it as close to this bone as I can here. I want as much meat there as possible. Just make a pretty solid cut through there. And again, you'll see if I was to leave that there, there's like no meat there for a judge to even have a bite, right? It's just kind of a waste of meat. Then the next thing I'm going to do here is probably, you'll see there's a bone here. I'm going to cut that one and probably this one here too. So again, just 1 quick cut and we're through. Okay, so got a pretty good rack here. One thing that I'll try sometimes is to flip this over and see if it looks pretty straight, and it does. Sometimes I might take a little bit off up here, and to do that I would take this back here and just kind of like run a line right here. Probably even show you a little bit of it, just to kind of square it up just a little bit more. You're going to see these little pieces of bone here, cartilage and stuff. That's kind of what you want to see. You don't want to be getting into the rib, the actual rib bone down in there. It's going to pull back too much. And so, but again, you're going to want this to be as square as possible, which this one looks like it really is. So kind of discard some of this here. Okay. So we've gotten pretty far here. The next thing I'm going to do is grab a couple paper towels. So we're trying to get the membrane off of the rib here. And on a baby back, you can typically leave that membrane on there sometimes and maybe score it a little bit. Some guys don't even do that if you're cooking that at home. But on a spare rib, you're going to want to get this membrane off here that's on the back of the ribs. It's just something that if you don't, it's going to be something you're not going to want to take a bite of. So First thing I'm going to do is kind of pat this down just a little bit to make it a little dry. And you'll see if I kind of get underneath here, that membrane's already starting to pull up. Some guys will take a butter knife or something like that and stick it under there or use their thumb. I typically try to get it with this paper towel here. And you'll see it's starting to already pull back there a little bit. And if you can get it in one tear, consider yourself a pro, but sometimes it takes me a couple times, honestly. Kind of wants to tear in different directions and stuff, but I'll kind of turn this like this and just get a good hold of it with that paper towel. If you don't get it in one time, that's okay. You'll see I didn't up here, I missed some of it. Some guys will leave a little bit on up here, so then the bones don't pull all the way out and gives you a little more stability and sturdiness on that rib. That's pretty good. We'll probably leave that like that. So then the last thing you really want to do is you flip this over here, and I'm going to want to take just a little bit of this fat out here because a lot of this fat's not going to cook down. And when I'm talking about that, I mean this part right here. You can see that it's probably not going to melt out. So I just kind of careful here, but I take the knife, just apply a little bit of pressure. And you don't want to gouge in too far here, but get some of this fat out of here so the judge isn't going to have a bite of that white fat. And just a simple sawing motion there. Again, just kind of picking that up a little bit. You don't have to get it all out. You can leave some of that in there, but just kind of get that out of there. Okay. It's looking pretty good. I might take just a little bit more out of there. Again, a lot of that's not really going to cook out. Okay. I think that looks pretty good. I feel pretty good about that rack of ribs there. Like you can see, it's a pretty solid rack of ribs. You have, we're counting bones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Again, I'm probably only going to get about 4 out of there, so that gives me a good 5 ribs to kind of test, see the ones I like. Especially when we get them on the board after they're cooked, seasoning them, tasting them, putting sauce on them, see if they're dialed up, and if they're not, continue to test. So that is a comp rib trim right there, and we'll be throwing those on the drum in a couple days here at the Jack. So thank you for watching our video.